There is a stream in the Highlands where no shepherd leads his flock to drink. It runs clear over black stones cold as January, threading through a glen where birch trees lean like old women remembering. The water makes no particular sound, just the eternal whisper of current over rock, the breath of the earth itself, rising white in the dawn chill. And yet travelers have turned back from this place for 300 years, not from fear of the water, but from fear of what kneels beside it, a woman, always bent, always washing, her hands moving in the rhythm older than speech. Dip, ring, spread. Dip, ring, spread. The cloth she cleanses never comes clean. It blooms red in her fingers again and again, as if the fabric itself remembers wounds that will not close. She does not look up when you approach. She does not need to. She knows you are coming. She has always known. In Gaelic, they call her the Bean Nighe, the washing woman. In the old stories, she is the sister spirit of the Banshee. But where the Banshee wails at windows, the Bean Nighe works in silence, her keening replaced by the sound of water. She is found at fords and river crossings, at the liminal places where one world touches another, at thresholds, at endings. She is washing a shroud. The question is, whose? This is not a ghost story, though she appears to the living. This is not a fairy tale, though she dwells in that borderland between. This is something older, a memory carried in water, a warning woven into the sound of streams. The Bean Nighe is omen and witness, prophet and mourner, the keeper of a knowledge no one wishes to possess. She is the face mortality wears when it comes with a scythe, but with tenderness, with preparation, with the terrible mercy of foreknowledge. To see her is to know death is near. But whose death, and why does she wash? Come, walk with me beside these haunted waters. We are going back, far back, to the source springs where goddesses became spirits, where prophecy flowed into streams, where the ancient Celts understood what we have forgotten, that water remembers everything, and that some songs can only be heard by those who stand close enough to the crossing place. The mist is rising. The washer is waiting. Before there was the washer, there was the scream. Before the lonely woman at the ford, there was the war goddess striding across battlefields, her shadow long as famine, her voice the breaking of men's courage. In the oldest layers of Irish mythology, death came as a trinity. 3 faces of the same terrible power, 3 names for the darkness that swallows kingdoms. The Morrígan, Badb, Macha. They were called the Morrígna, the phantom queens, the choosers of the slain. They appeared before battles as crows and ravens, as women washing armor in rivers running red, as prophets speaking doom in verses that could not be unspoken. The Morrígan herself was sovereignty and slaughter intertwined, the land made flesh, the sexual and the sepulchral married in one form. She came to the hero Shu Shullen before his final battle, appeared at a ford, washing his bloodied armor and weapons, performing the grim ritual that marked him for death. He knew then, the washing meant the ending. This is the first image. This is where it begins. The goddess at the water's edge, cleaning the evidence of violence that has not yet occurred. prophecy manifesting not as speech, but as action, as a domestic task transformed into cosmic theater. The battlefield laundress, the divine charwoman of doom. She does not cause death. She merely sees it approaching, acknowledges it, prepares for it with the methodical patience of one who has witnessed this cycle 10,000 times. In the Tainbo Cuailnga, that great cattle raid epic of Ulster, the Morrígan washes at fords before conflicts, her presence a harbinger so absolute that warriors would turn back rather than face her. But she was not only terror, she was truth. She was the part of fate that cannot be bribed or seduced or fought. When she appeared to wash, she was already mourning, already performing the first rituals of grief. But goddesses, like empires, do not last forever. Something happened in the long twilight of Celtic paganism. As Christianity spread across Ireland, as the old gods were diminished and recast, the great Morrigan began to fragment. Her power dispersed like mist. Her scream softened. Her crow form shrank. And in that contraction, that reduction, something new emerged, or rather something newly visible to common eyes. The being Nighe. She retained the goddess's location, the ford, the crossing, the river. She retained her function, the prophecy of death, the washing of shrouds. But she lost her grandeur. No longer a queen of battles, she became a local spirit, a solitary figure haunting particular streams in particular glens. No longer divine, she became almost human, almost but not quite. The folk memory of the Morrigan persisted in her form, but domesticated, personalized, brought down from cosmic warfare to individual tragedy. This is the great transformation of Celtic mythology. From pantheon to parish, from gods to ghosts, from the universal to the particular. The being Nighe is the Morrigan's daughter, her diminished heir, carrying the same message in a quieter voice. She is what remains when faith changes hands, when the old powers are too deeply rooted to be erased and too dangerous to be left unaltered. And yet, in this reduction, something was gained. For the being Nighe, unlike her divine ancestor, could be approached, could be questioned. The rules that grew around her in Highland and Irish folklore suggest not merely terror, but possibility. If you saw her first, before she saw you, you might demand 3 wishes. If you crept close enough to suckle at her breast, that strange, grotesque detail preserved in dozens of accounts, she would grant you a favor and call you her foster child. If you asked the right questions in the right way, she would tell you whose death she was preparing for. She became, in other words, not merely a portent, but a negotiation. A threshold figure in every sense, between life and death, between mortal and supernatural, between fate and free will. The goddess had proclaimed, the spirit might parley. This is crucial to understanding her. The being Nighe is not a demon. She does not kill. She does not curse. She only sees, and in seeing, she prepares. The washing is an act of service, of ritual care. She cleanses the shroud so that the dying may cross over clean, may be received properly into whatever lies beyond. There is tenderness in this, however terrible. There is the same impulse that drives a midwife to wash a newborn, a mother to prepare her child for sleep. Death, in the Celtic imagination, required such preparation. The scholar Alexander Carmichael, wandering the Outer Hebrides in the 1860s, recorded dozens of accounts of the being Nighe. In his Carmina Gadelica, that monumental collection of Highland prayers and traditions, she appears again and again, sometimes glimpsed at dusk, sometimes heard in the darkness, her washing board slapping against stone, her breath audible over the murmur of streams. The people who reported seeing her were not superstitious peasants, but farmers, fishermen, shepherds, practical people whose lives depended on sharp observation and clear thinking. They described her with specificity. Her dress, her posture, her web-footed gait, the particular quality of her grief. For she was always grieving, even when the death she foretold was days or weeks away. Her sorrow was present tense, as if time meant nothing to her, as if past and future washed together in the same cold water. This is the inheritance from the Morrígan, the ability to stand outside time's current, to see what is coming with the clarity of what has already been. Prophecy is not fortune-telling. It is the vision that sees the pattern whole, the tapestry complete, where mortal eyes see only threads. The voice. Before water became the washer beside water. The scream became silence. But the knowledge, the awful, necessary knowledge, remained. In the late autumn of 1745, a tacksman named Donald MacLeod was riding home to Skye after dark. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to see by, and the track followed a burn that ran quick with recent rain. He was thinking of nothing in particular, of his supper waiting, perhaps, or the cattle price at the last market, when his horse stopped, simply stopped, mid-stride, and would not move. MacLeod urged it forward. The animal trembled, its ears flat, its nostrils flared. And then MacLeod heard it, the slap of wet cloth on stone, regular as a heartbeat. He dismounted, left the horse, walked toward the sound. At the ford, where the path crossed the burn, a woman knelt in the shallows. Her back was to him, her hair hung long and unbound, dark as peat water, and her arms moved in their eternal rhythm. Dip, ring, spread. Dip, ring, spread. He could see the cloth clearly in the moonlight. White linen, or it should have been white. But as she lifted it, wrung it, the water that poured from it ran dark, ran red, stained the stones around her knees. MacLeod did not call out. Some instinct older than thought kept him silent. He stood and watched, and in watching noticed details that would trouble him the rest of his life. Her feet, webbed and gray like those of a goose. Her breasts, hanging long and pendulous, visible through her thin dress. The way she moved without ever looking up, without acknowledging the living world around her. And then, without turning, she spoke. "Donald MacLeod of Galtragill," she said, her voice like wind over water, "your cousin Iaian will not see another spring." The cloth she was washing, MacLeod saw it now, was a shirt he recognized, his cousin's shirt, the one with the torn sleeve still unrepaired. Iaian had worn it 3 days before. MacLeod fled, rode home, said nothing to anyone. Iaian MacLeod died of fever in February, 3 months later, on a night when the burn ran so high with snowmelt that no one could cross it for 2 days. This account, a composite of dozens like it recorded across the Highlands, captures the essential encounter with the being Nighe. She is always at water, always washing, always specific, and she always knows your name. The Scottish being Nighe differs slightly from her Irish cousin. In Ireland, she is sometimes called the Banshee, the woman of the fairy mounds, ancestor of the Banshee. Her cry a lament for old families losing their heirs. But in Scotland, particularly in the Highlands and Islands, she is quieter, more solitary, bound to particular locations rather than particular families. She is the spirit of place, as much as the spirit of prophecy. Each glen, each ford, each lonely stream seem to have its own washer, or the possibility of one. The people of Argyll spoke of sightings near Loch Awe, where the being Nighe appeared before clan battles, washing the plaids of men who would fall. In the Hebrides, she haunted the crossings between islands, seen by fishermen who would drown within the week. On Skye, she favored the rivers that ran down from the Cuillin, those dark mountains where the old gods were said to sleep. The folklore collector John Gregerson Campbell, a minister from Tiree, spent decades gathering accounts from the Gaelic-speaking islanders in the late 1800s. His Superstitions of the Highlands and Islands of Scotland preserves their voices. Crofters who saw her at dawn, women who heard her singing in the darkness, shepherds who smelled the lye soap smell of her washing carried on the wind. Campbell approached this material with scholarly skepticism, yet even he admitted that the consistency of the accounts, the specific details that recurred across time and geography, suggested something more than mere invention. She was almost always small, almost always dressed in green or gray, or sometimes in a winding sheet. Her feet, when visible, were webbed. This detail appears so frequently that it must have meant something to those who first shaped the legend. Perhaps it marked her as belonging to water, as amphibious, able to move between the element and the air. Perhaps it suggested she was not wholly woman, not wholly natural. And there were rules for encountering her. Strict, elaborate rules that suggest generations of refinement, of lessons learned through terrible experience. If you saw her first, before she saw you, you held power. You could demand 3 wishes, or 1 great wish, and she must grant it. But if she saw you first, you were hers, marked. The death she was washing for might be your own. If you were brave enough, or desperate enough, you could creep up behind her and take her breast in your mouth, suckling as a child suckles. This act, bizarre and primal, made you her foster child, and she would answer any question you asked. But it required touching her, coming that close, and her skin was said to be cold as river stones, cold as clay. You could also seize the end of the shroud she was washing, hold it tight, refuse to let go. She would be forced to reveal whose death it portended. But you must not loosen your grip, not for an instant, or she would vanish like mist, and you would be left holding only water. These rules speak to a deep human need, the need to transform prophecy from passive reception to active engagement, to wrest some agency from fate itself. The Nighe is terrible, yes, but she is not arbitrary. She can be approached, she can be bargained with, She exists in that gray zone between doom and chance, where cunning and courage might yet make a difference. But most who saw her did neither of these things. Most simply fled, for to know the future, to know specifically, intimately, whose death is approaching, is a knowledge that burns. It grants no power to prevent. It offers only the burden of waiting, of watching the person marked move through their final days in ignorance. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of the being Nighe, not that she appears, but that her appearance changes nothing. The washing continues. The death comes. All she offers is the time to prepare, to mourn preemptively, to say what must be said while there is still time to say it. Lady Wilde, in her Ancient Legends of Ireland, published in 1887, describes the washer as a woman who died in childbirth, condemned to wash clothes at lonely streams until the hour when she would have naturally died had she lived. This version softens her somewhat, makes her a victim as much as a portent. She is performing penance, or perhaps simply enduring, trapped between what was and what might have been. But in the Highlands, the older, harder interpretation prevailed. She was not punished. She simply was, as inevitable as winter, as necessary as grief. A function of the universe made visible, made female, made to kneel beside cold water in the hour before dawn. The last widely reported sighting in Scotland occurred in 1910, near Glen Lyon in Perthshire. A shepherd named Malcolm Stewart saw her washing at a ford on a Tuesday morning in October. He did not approach, did not speak. He knew the old stories. His father died 8 days later, falling from a crag while searching for a lost ewe. Stewart told the minister who recorded the account that he had seen the shirt clearly, his father's shirt, the old tweed one with the leather buttons. After that, silence. The Highland clearances scattered the people. The old language faded. The burns ran on, but fewer walked beside them who remembered the names of what lived there. The Bean Nighe did not vanish. The stories insist she cannot vanish, that she is too old, too rooted. But she retreated into that twilight where folklore lives when it is no longer quite believed, but not quite disbelieved either. She is there still, they say, waiting at the ford, washing. The Bean Nighe was not alone in her vigil. Across the scattered Celtic lands, those wind-scoured coasts and mountain-guarded valleys where the old tongue survived longest, the washer appeared in many guises bearing many names, yet always recognizable. Always at water, always mourning. The form shifted, but the function remained. She was the voice of waters crying out for the dead, the personification of that mournful sound a stream makes when the wind blows across it just so, like breath across the mouth of a bottle, like keening. In Wales, they called her the Seeraith, a word that means wraith or spectre, derived from the Old Welsh corf, meaning corpse. She was heard more often than seen, her voice a multiple-noted wail that seemed to come from the air itself, from no particular direction. The Reverend Edmund Jones, writing in 1780, described the Seeraith as a doleful, disagreeable sound heard before the deaths of many, and most apt to be heard before foul weather. She cried out at night, her voice multiplying as it echoed off hillsides, and those who heard her knew. someone was leaving. But the Welsh washer also appeared at fords and bridges, at the meeting of stream and road, just as her Scottish cousin did. In Glamorgan, accounts speak of her washing grave clothes at a particular crossing near Cardiff. Her presence guaranteed death within the household of whoever saw her within 3 days. In Gwynedd, she haunted mountain streams, and her cry was said to predict not individual deaths, but disasters, mining collapses, shipwrecks, entire families lost to disease or misfortune. The Welsh elaborated her sound. Unlike the silent bean Nighe, the Saihraith was auditory, her entire being concentrated into that cry. Sometimes it was a single voice, high and clear as a bell. Sometimes it was a chorus, as if multiple mourners wailed together. Sometimes it proceeded in a terrible logic. 1 cry for a child's death, 2 for a woman's, 3 for a man's, 5 for someone of importance. The number of cries told you not only that death was coming, but what kind of death, whose absence would mark the community. This attention to sound suggests something crucial about Celtic death omens. They were not visual primarily, but sonic. The landscape itself was believed to speak, to cry out, to carry messages in the wind and water. The washer's silence in Scotland contrasts with the Saihraith's wailing in Wales, yet both are acoustic events. The absence of sound and the presence of sound, 2 sides of the same coin. On the Isle of Man, that small kingdom between Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, the tradition merged with others to produce the Banshee, or Banshee, explicitly connected to the Irish Banshee, but retaining the washer's attributes. The Manx folklorist A.W. Moore recorded accounts in the 1890s of a spirit who appeared at fords washing shrouds, but who also wailed outside the homes of old families. She was transition incarnate between Irish and Scottish traditions, between washing and wailing, between silence and song. In Cornwall, that last Celtic stronghold of England, she appeared as the Seorach, a name derived from the same root as Saihraith in Welsh, meaning shriek or scream. The Cornish washer was particularly associated with mines and with the sea, those 2 great Cornish industries of death. Miners' wives reported hearing her crying in the shaft works before collapses. Fishermen's families spoke of seeing her on the cliffs, washing nets or sails in pools of seawater before storms that would take boats. Each region adapted the archetype to its landscape and its particular relationship with mortality. In mountainous areas, she haunted high streams and lonely tarns. On islands, she appeared on shores, washing at the tide line. In river valleys, she kept to fords and crossings. But everywhere, the essential elements remained: water, washing, prophecy, and the feminine form as witness. Why water? The question is central. Why not fire or stone or open fields? Why must she always be at rivers, always washing? The Celts, like many pre-industrial peoples, held water sacred. Rivers were not merely geographical features, but living entities, possessed of their own spirits and agency. Springs were portals to the otherworld, those Cid or fairy mounds from which the supernatural emerged. To throw valuable objects into water, swords, torques, cauldrons, was to give them to the gods, to send them across that boundary between worlds. Water was also the element of transition. It flows, it changes. It is never the same from moment to moment. You cannot step in the same river twice. And in that constant flux, that perpetual motion, the Celts saw an image of life itself, flowing from source to sea, from birth to death, from one state to another. Water was becoming. And washing is transformation through water. It is the removal of one state, the preparation for another. The washer at the ford is performing that transformation ritual, cleaning away the stains of life to prepare for what comes after. She is not destroying but transitioning, not cursing but consecrating. The fact that she appears before death, washing shrouds that are not yet needed, suggests that in Celtic belief, death was not a sudden rupture, but a process, a gradual crossing that began before the body failed. The soul was already departing. The washer acknowledged this departure, honored it, prepared the way. In Ireland, another variation appears, the Banshee or Banshee, whose name means simply woman of the fairy mound. While the Banshee is best known for her wail, many accounts describe her washing. Thomas Crofton Croker, in his Fairy Legends and Traditions of the South of Ireland, 1825, recounts multiple stories of women in white, seen at streams at night, washing burial clothes, their keening carrying for miles. The Banshee retained her aristocratic associations. She mourned for old Gaelic families, for the O and Mac names that carried the weight of centuries, but her function was the same: to announce, to mourn, to prepare. Croker interviewed dozens of people who claimed to have heard or seen the Banshee, and what emerges from these accounts is not folklore in the dismissive sense, but lived tradition. People structuring their experience of death and grief through a pre-existing narrative framework that gave shape and meaning to the inexplicable. When someone heard a cry in the night and their grandfather died the next day, the Banshee provided an explanation, a sense that the universe was ordered, that death did not come randomly, but was announced, acknowledged, mourned. The washer, in all her forms, served this function. She was the community's grief made manifest. She was the acknowledgement that death is not a private event, but a rupture in the social fabric, something that must be witnessed and mourned collectively. Her appearance before death gave the community time to prepare, to gather, to say goodbyes. She was an early warning system, yes, but also a ritual spaceholder, a figure who marked the beginning of mourning before mourning became official. This is why she endured so long. This is why people continued to report, seeing her, hearing her, well into the 20th century. Not because they were gullible or primitive, but because she fulfilled a need, the need to have death announced, to have time to prepare, to have the crossing acknowledged by something larger than human knowing. The crying waters spoke, and for centuries, people listened. The evidence is not theory, it is testimony. It is the voice of a woman in County Cork in 1863, recorded by Crofton Croker, saying, "I saw her, sir, as clear as I see you now, at the ford below the house. She had my husband's shirt in her hands, the one I just mended that Tuesday, and he was drowned in the bay come Friday, though he'd been sailing those waters 40 years. It is the account of a soldier in the 78th Highland Regiment, written in a letter home from the Crimean Peninsula in 1854. The night before Balaclava, 3 of us saw her by the stream where we were camped. We said nothing to each other, but we knew. Of the 3, I alone came back. It is the matter-of-fact entry in a Scottish minister's diary from 1791. Andrew Ross reports seeing the washerwoman at Glenmore Ford this morning before dawn. His wife Eleanor has been failing these 2 weeks. I should visit. These are not legends passed down through generations, growing more elaborate with each telling. These are contemporary accounts, specific, dated, attributed. They describe particular places at particular times, witnessed by people whose names we know, whose lives can be traced through census records and parish registers. This does not make them true in the empirical sense. We cannot prove the being Nighe exists, but it makes them real in another sense. Real as experience, as cultural phenomenon, as a lens through which communities understood and processed mortality. Consider the account from Skye, preserved in the collections of the School of Scottish Studies at the University of Edinburgh. In 1902, a midwife named Morag McKinnon was called to a difficult birth in a crofter's cottage near Portree. It was late autumn, still dark when she set out, and the track to the cottage followed a burn for half a mile. Morag walked quickly. The message had been urgent, and as she approached the ford where the path crossed the water, she saw a figure kneeling in the shallows. A woman bent over washing. Morag stopped. She knew what this meant. She had been raised on the old stories, had heard her grandmother speak of the Bean Nighe as others spoke of neighbors. And she knew the rules. Look first, and you have power. She called out, her voice sharp in the cold air. "Whose shroud do you wash?" The figure did not look up, but she spoke, her voice like water over stones. "Go to the cottage, Morag McKinnon. Do your work. This washing is not yet for that house." Morag went. The birth was difficult, but both mother and child survived. Morag stayed 3 days, as was customary, helping the new mother recover. On the 3rd night, walking home in darkness, she passed the ford again. The washer was still there, still washing, the same rhythm, the same bent back, the same red stain spreading in the water. This time, Morag did not stop. This time she knew. She reached her own cottage to find her husband, Iyain, dead in his chair by the fire. Heart failure, the doctor would say later. He had simply stopped. The last thing he had been doing was mending a fishing net, and the net was still spread across his lap, still wet with seawater, when Morag found him. The story was recorded in 1963 by the folklorist Donald Archie MacDonald, interviewing Morag's daughter, who was present at the telling. Morag lived until 1945, and she told this story only once, at the end of her life, when her own death was near. She was there for him, Morag said. She was washing for him. And I walked right past her, going to bring another life into the world. That's the way of it. That's how it turns. Or consider the testimony of a shepherd named Hugh MacLeod, recorded in J.G. Campbell's Witchcraft and Second Sight in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, 1902. I was on the hill above Loch Slappin at the dawn, looking for lambs. The mist was thick, and I heard the sound of washing before I saw her. She was at the burn that comes down from Blabeen, kneeling where the water pools before it drops. I crept close. I was young then, and brave with ignorance. I could see her face in the moment she lifted it to wring the cloth. It was my mother's face. My mother, but not my mother. Younger perhaps, or older, I could not tell. But I knew her. And the cloth she washed was my sister's shawl, the red one, the one she'd worn to the communion. I did not speak. I went home. 3 days later, my sister's body was found below the cliffs at Elgol. She had been gathering dulse and slipped on the wet rocks. The shawl was still wrapped around her, still red, though the sea had taken her half a day before we found her. Hugh MacLeod lived another 60 years. He never returned to that particular burn. He never spoke of what he saw except this once, to Campbell, who wrote it down in the careful hand of a scholar who does not quite believe, but cannot quite dismiss. These accounts share certain features: the unexpectedness of the encounter, the recognition of specific items being washed, the silence or sparseness of the interaction, the terrible accuracy of the prophecy, and the lasting effect on the witness. Those who saw the washer were changed. They carried the knowledge for the rest of their lives. They walked differently through the world, knowing that there are things that cannot be explained, forces that do not obey the rationalist order, and that death announces itself in ways no science can measure. The sociologist Emil Durkheim would call this a collective representation, a shared symbolic structure through which a community processes reality. But to those who saw her, the Bean Nighe was not a symbol. She was an event, a presence as real as stone. What do we do with such testimonies? The modern impulse is to explain them away. Grief hallucinations, misidentified objects in poor light, the power of cultural expectation to shape perception. And perhaps there is truth in these explanations. Perhaps every sighting of the Bean Nighe can be reduced to synapses in psychology, to the brain's desperate need to make meaning from chaos. But to do so is to miss the point entirely. For whether the washer exists objectively or only in the shared imagination of communities who believe in her, she functions the same way. She marks transitions. She announces endings. She creates a ritual space in which grief can begin. She transforms private terror into communal recognition. She says death is coming, and we will mourn together, and the crossing will be witnessed. This is not superstition. This is technology, the technology of meaning-making, the social machinery that allows people to survive the unsurvivable. The washer at the ford is one of humanity's oldest grief counselors, and perhaps that is proof enough. Water is the element of remembering. Rivers carry stones from mountains to sea, grinding them down over centuries, transforming granite into sand, recording in their courses the memory of ancient ice and vanished forests. Springs rise from aquifers that may be thousands of years old, their water falling as rain in a different climate, filtering down through limestone, emerging unchanged. To drink from a spring is to drink time itself, to put in your mouth the same water that sustained your ancestors, that will sustain your descendants. The Celts knew this. Their landscapes were mapped not by roads, but by sacred waters. Every spring, every well, every river confluence had a name, a history, a presiding spirit. The Boyne River in Ireland was the goddess Boann herself, whose overflow created the river when she walked around a forbidden well 3 times. The River Clyde in Scotland was Clota, the cleansing one, a goddess of purification. In Wales, springs were dressed with offerings, approached with prayers, consulted for visions and healings. Water was not inert matter. It was living memory, liquid consciousness, the blood of the Earth Mother. And washing in such water was a sacred act. Think of baptism, that later Christian practice grafted onto older pagan roots. Immersion in water as transformation, as rebirth, as cleansing from one state into another. The water removes the old self, prepares the way for the new. The same logic operates in the Bean Nighe's washing. She is preparing the dead for their crossing, cleansing them of the stains and attachments of life, so they may pass freely into death. In this reading, she is not a prophet, but a psychopomp, a guide of souls, a midwife of death. Her washing is not mere symbol, but actual spiritual labor, as necessary to the dying as the midwife's hands are to the birthing. The ancient Celts had a complex cosmology of death. The other world was not distant heaven, but a parallel realm, accessible at certain times and places. At Samhain, Halloween, when the veil between worlds thinned, at liminal locations like fords, crossings, shorelines, in sacred spaces like burial mounds and stone circles. Death was not an ending, but a transition, a journey from this world to the next, and like any journey, it required preparation. The washer dwells at exactly such a liminal space, the ford, where water is neither deep nor shallow, where travelers must lift their feet from solid ground and trust themselves to the current, however briefly. To cross a ford is to enact in miniature the crossing into death, a threshold moment, a step of faith, a temporary abandoning of the firm earth. She is the attendant at this crossing. But there is another layer. The washer is consistently female, consistently engaged in domestic labor. Washing, that quintessential woman's work, the endless cycle of cleaning and maintenance that keeps life running. Why? One answer lies in Celtic reverence for female sovereignty and death power. The Morrígan, Badb, and Macha were not aberrations, but central to Irish mythology. Women who controlled life and death, who decided the fates of heroes and kings. The island itself was often imagined as female, Eriu, Banba, Fodla, the triple goddess of Ireland. To die was to return to the land, to the mother, to be received back into her body. The washer, then, is the face of this mother in her death aspect. Not the nurturing breast, but the preparing hand. Not the cradle, but the shroud. She is what the scholar Marion Woodman would call the Dark Mother, the archetype that acknowledges that birth and death are mirrors, that every mother who brings life is also inevitably preparing that life for death. This is not morbidity, but realism, the profound and terrible honesty of matriarchal spirituality. In Scottish Highland culture, there was also the figure of the Cailleach, the old woman, the hag, the goddess of winter and death. She was the ancient one who shaped mountains, who herded deer, who brought the killing frosts. The Cailleach was not evil, but essential, the necessary death that makes room for spring, the pruning that allows growth. Without her, the world would be only summer, only growth, only life, and therefore no life at all, because nothing could renew. The being Nighe shares the Kylax's liminality. She is old, or seems so, even when her face is young. She is neither alive nor dead herself, but suspended between, performing her eternal task. She is the agent of winter in the cycle of life, the one who says, "This growth has run its course. It is time for the harvest. It is time for the field to lie fallow." And washing. Washing is purification, yes, but also dissolution. Water breaks down, softens, releases. In traditional Highland funerary practices, the body of the deceased was washed by women of the community, prepared with sacred attention, dressed in grave clothes. This was not medical hygiene, but ritual. The washing away of life's residue, the anointing, the preparation for the next world. The being Nighe performs this washing before death, not after. She washes proactively, preparing the garments that will be needed soon. This is extraordinary. It suggests that death is not instant but gradual, that the soul begins to separate from the body days or even weeks before the final breath. The washer is tending to this proto-death, this shadow death, acknowledging what the living cannot yet see. Modern physics tells us that time is not linear, that past and future may coexist in ways we cannot perceive. The being Nighe seems to operate in such a time. She washes clothes that are simultaneously clean and bloodied. She mourns deaths that are simultaneously future and present. She exists in the eternal now of the stream, where water that has passed and water that is coming are the same water. This is the mystery of the washing. It is not prediction, but perception. She does not cause death by washing. She washes because she sees death, sees it with an awareness that transcends temporal sequence. She is the consciousness of the moment made visible, the point where cause collapses into effect, where fate and event merge. In Jungian psychology, water is the symbol of the unconscious, that deep realm of psyche, where personal and collective memories swirl together. To dream of water is to dream of the hidden self, the primordial emotions, the ancient patterns that shape us without our knowing. The washer at the ford is the unconscious made visible, the deep knowledge rising to the surface, the message from below that death is approaching, not as threat but as information, as truth that the conscious mind resists. She is what we know, but do not want to know. She is what we sense, but cannot speak. She is the grief that begins before the loss, the mourning that starts while the beloved still breathes. And she is still there, beneath the surface of every stream, waiting, washing, remembering what has not yet happened, because in the waters of memory, everything has already happened and is happening still. The river flows both ways. Consider the evolutionary puzzle of precognition. Why would humans develop the capacity, or the belief in the capacity, to foresee death? What possible survival advantage could come from knowing, without ability to prevent, that someone you love will die? It seems a purely maladaptive trait, a source of anticipatory grief that serves no function, offers no benefit, simply weighs down the bearer with terrible knowledge. Unless foreknowledge is not about prevention but preparation, unless the point is not to stop death, but to ready oneself and one's community for its arrival. Unless prophecy is evolution's way of giving us time to gather resources, time to say goodbye, time to put affairs in order, time to begin the psychological work of grieving before the full weight of loss descends. This is the hidden mercy of the being Nighe. She does not give you the power to save, but she gives you the power to prepare. And in pre-modern, pre-medical societies, this was no small gift. Death came suddenly, without warning, accident, illness, violence. To have even a few days' notice was to have time to bring the family together, to perform last rites, to speak what needed speaking. The washer, then, is not merely supernatural, but deeply psychological. She is the externalized intuition, the subconscious knowledge made visible. We recognize in her the truth that part of us always knows when death is near, knows from 1,000 subtle signs that the conscious mind refuses to process. The slight change in breathing, the particular quality of pallor, the way someone's eyes look when they have begun the internal work of leaving. Doctors and nurses speak of this even now. The sense that a patient is actively dying, the awareness that transcends vital signs and monitoring equipment. Family members report dreams, premonitions, inexplicable urges to visit or call shortly before a loved one's death. The psychological literature on anticipatory awareness is extensive and well documented. We know, on some level, we sense the thinning of the veil. The being Nighe gives form to this sensing. She takes the formless anxiety, the inexplicable dread, and shapes it into narrative, into image, into a figure who can be approached and questioned and, in being approached, somehow made bearable. She transforms the diffuse terror of mortality into a specific encounter with a specific being at a specific place. She makes death concrete, and concrete things can be faced. Carl Jung wrote extensively about death archetypes in the collective unconscious. The old wise woman, the terrible mother, the crone, the fate weaver. These figures recur across cultures not because they are literally real, but because they are psychologically real. They represent universal patterns of human experience, ways that the psyche structures its confrontation with the fundamental mysteries of existence. The washer is one such archetype, the death mother, the one who sees endings, who presides over transitions, who performs the necessary rituals. She appears in dreams even now. In the dreams of people who have never heard of the being Nighe, who know nothing of Celtic folklore. A woman at water, washing, her face obscured or ambiguous. The dreamer knows without being told what this means. This is the power of archetype. It needs no explanation because it speaks directly to the deepest layers of psyche, the pre-verbal, pre-rational knowing that preceded language and will outlast it. But there is also a gendered dimension to this archetype that deserves examination. The washer is always female. The tradition does not record male death prophets at fords, male washers preparing shrouds. Why? One answer lies in traditional gender roles. Women washed clothes, tended the sick, prepared bodies for burial. Women were the stewards of thresholds, birth, marriage, death, the great transitions of life. They had the intimate bodily knowledge of what it meant to pass from one state to another. They were, in a sense, professional liminal beings, constantly negotiating boundaries, constantly performing transformations. But there is something deeper, the association of femininity with intuition, with the sensing of what is hidden, with the capacity to endure and acknowledge painful truths. In patriarchal societies, women were given, or claimed, the spiritual work that men refused, the tending of the dying, the handling of grief, the maintenance of memory. The washer is the embodiment of this work, elevated to cosmic significance. She is the acknowledgement that death is women's labor as much as birth is. The contemporary scholar Clarissa Pinkola Estes, in her work on feminine archetypes, speaks of the life-death-life nature, the understanding that creation and destruction are not opposites, but partners in an eternal cycle. Women, she argues, have always understood this more intimately because of their bodily experience of menstruation, pregnancy, birth, the knowledge that life requires blood, that creation involves loss, that new beginnings necessitate endings. The being Nighe is the life-death-life nature personified. She washes the shrouds so new life can emerge. She mourns so renewal can begin. She witnesses endings so beginnings are possible. She is not anti-life, but the necessary dark half of the life force itself. And there is another psychological function: permission. Permission to grieve before the loss is official. Permission to acknowledge fear and dread and sorrow. Permission to begin the emotional work of letting go while there is still time. In cultures where stoicism was valued, where showing emotion was weakness, the washer provided a socially acceptable framework for anticipatory mourning. You did not weep because you were weak. You wept because you had seen the washer. You did not speak of death because you were morbid. You spoke because the omen had appeared. She authorized grief. She made visible what everyone felt, but no one could say, that death was coming, and it was right to mourn, and mourning could begin now. In this sense, the being Nighe is a communal emotional technology, a way of managing the psychological strain of living in a world where death was omnipresent and often sudden. She did not cause the pain. The pain was already there. She simply gave it form, direction, permission to exist. The modern world has largely lost such technologies. We have therapists and grief counselors, yes, but we have few cultural rituals that acknowledge foreknowledge, few frameworks for anticipatory mourning. We are expected to be surprised by death, to maintain hope until the end, to not give up, to fight. The notion that one might begin grieving before death occurs, might start preparing emotionally for an inevitable loss, is often seen as morbid or pessimistic or giving up. But perhaps the washer knew better. Perhaps she understood that grief, like birth, is a process, not an event, and that the process begins before the moment of transition, not after. Perhaps she was doing us the kindness of starting the work early, so the full weight would not crash down all at once. The washer at the ford is the therapist we forgot we needed. She is still there, beneath the surface of dreams, in the quiet intuitions we dismiss, in the foreknowledge we refuse to acknowledge. Washing, always washing, preparing us for what we already know is coming. By 1950, the washer was nearly gone. The Highland clearances had emptied the glens. The Gaelic language retreated to the westernmost islands, spoken by grandparents, but not grandchildren. Electricity came to the crofts. Radios brought BBC voices into kitchens where the old stories had once been told. The streams ran on, but fewer walked beside them who remembered what lived there. The folklorists who visited in those years, Hamish Henderson, Callum MacLean, the teams from the School of Scottish Studies, found themselves racing against time, recording the last fluent speakers, the last tradition bearers. The Bean Nighe came up in interviews, but as memory, not as living belief. My grandmother saw her once, people said. My father's uncle heard her. The encounters had moved one generation back, then two, then three. She was becoming legend. The scholar Max Weber called this disenchantment the gradual draining of magic from the world, the replacement of spirits and signs with mechanisms and statistics. Modernity did not disprove the Bean Nighe. It simply made her irrelevant. Death could be explained medically. Grief could be managed pharmaceutically. Prophecy was superstition. The waters were just H2O, hydrogen and oxygen, 2 parts to 1, chemical composition, nothing more. And yet she did not entirely disappear. She resurfaced in poetry. In Seamus Heaney's Casualty, the washing woman appears as metaphor for Irish political violence, the endless cleaning of blood that will not stay clean. In Nuala ní Domhnaill's Gaelic verses, the Bean Sea returns as feminist reclamation, a woman's rage and sorrow given voice against patriarchal silence. She appeared in film. The ghost in white beside the water in The Secret of Rowan Inish, the fairy tale figure in Undine, the eerie presence in countless Celtic-inflected horror movies. She had become aesthetic, atmosphere, a shorthand for the uncanny. She found new life in neo-pagan movements, in feminist spirituality, in the modern recovery of goddess worship. The washer was reclaimed as the dark goddess, the crone, the death mother who had been suppressed by Christianity and patriarchy. Women gathered at streams for ritual washings, invoking her as they invoked Hecate and Kali and all the death goddesses that religions had tried to erase. She became an archetype in Jungian workshops and women's circles, where participants were encouraged to meet her in guided meditations, to dialogue with her, to accept the death wisdom she offered. The washer was psychologized, internalized, transformed from external spirit to internal guide. Was this a resurrection or a distortion? A preservation or a predification? Perhaps both, perhaps neither. Perhaps she simply adapted, as she always had, to the new landscape. If the modern world no longer believed in spirits at fords, she would appear in dreams instead. If no one walked beside streams at dawn, she would manifest in poems and paintings. If the old language was dying, she would speak in the new. But something was lost. What was lost was the communal recognition, the shared framework of meaning. In traditional Highland society, Everyone knew the being Nighe. Everyone understood what it meant to see her. There was a consensus reality in which she operated, a social world that made space for her. When someone reported seeing her, they were believed, not blindly, but culturally. Their experience was validated, integrated, understood. In the modern world, such an experience would likely lead to a psychiatrist, not a storyteller. The person who saw a woman washing shrouds at dawn would be diagnosed, medicated, perhaps hospitalized. Their experience would be pathologized, not mythologized. They would be alone with their vision, unable to share it, unable to have it witnessed and acknowledged. This is the true vanishing, not of the washer herself, but of the cultural capacity to perceive her, to honor her, to allow her a place in reality. The philosopher Michel Foucault wrote about how modernity creates categories of madness, how certain experiences that were once acceptable become pathologized. To see visions, to hear voices, to perceive spirits. These were once considered gifts, marks of the seer, the poet, the holy fool. Now they are symptoms. Now they are disorders to be cured. The being Nighe is a casualty of this shift, not because she stopped appearing, but because we stopped being able to see her without thinking ourselves mad. And yet, reports persist. In online forums, in Reddit threads, in whispered conversations, people still describe encounters. A woman at a stream, washing something, gone when approached, and afterward, a death in the family. These accounts are dismissed, explained away, ignored, but they continue. In 2004, a hiker in Glencoe reported seeing a figure washing at a burn in early morning. He posted about it on a hill-walking forum, half joking, half serious. Other users replied with similar stories: a woman at a ford in Galloway, a figure by a stream in the Borders, a bent shape washing something at a crossing in Kintyre. One user wrote, "My gran saw her in 1943, before my grandfather was killed in Italy. I thought it was just family story until I saw something similar myself. Don't know what it was, don't want to know." The thread was locked by moderators for promoting superstition. This is the modern fate of the washer. She appears, but her appearances are not acknowledged. She is seen, but her seeing is not permitted. She exists in the cracks of consensus reality, glimpsed but not validated, experienced but not shared. Perhaps this is enough. Perhaps all myths need, in order to survive, is the occasional genuine encounter, the rare individual who sees and knows and carries the knowledge quietly. Perhaps the washer does not need crowds of believers, only the few who still walk by streams at dawn, still notice what lives at thresholds, still allow themselves to perceive what should not be there. Or perhaps she is truly fading. Perhaps the disenchantment is complete, and what remains is only echo, only residue, the afterimage of a belief that once shaped reality, but no longer can. In old age, the folklorist Alexander Carmichael wrote, "The people of the Highlands and Islands lived in a world we can scarcely imagine, a world where everything was alive, where the landscape spoke, where the old gods walked as neighbors. That world is gone. I fear we are poorer for its passing." He was right. We are poorer. We have gained much: medicine, literacy, comfort, security. But we have lost something too: the sense that the world is more than matter, that death is not merely cessation, that grief can be honored and shaped and ritualized through story. The washer at the ford was never about whether she was real. She was about whether we could bear to look at death, to acknowledge it, to prepare for it with tenderness and ritual. She was about creating space for sorrow in a harsh world. She was about saying, "Death is coming, and we will not look away, and the crossing will be witnessed." That at least is worth remembering. That at least should not vanish. The water is still running. This is the first thing to understand. The streams that held her are still there, still cold, still clear, still flowing from mountain to sea. The burns of Skye still tumble over black rock. The rivers of Argyll still pool at fords before rushing on. The springs in Galway still rise from limestone aquifers that have not changed in 10,000 years. The landscape endures, and in enduring, it remembers. There is a stream, let us not name it, for all streams are this stream, that runs through a glen where birch trees lean and mist rises white in the hour before dawn. At a particular ford where the current slows and deepens before dropping over a fall, there is a stone worn smooth by centuries of water. It is the size of a kneeling woman. It is the color of twilight. Sometimes, travelers who pass at dawn report seeing something: a shape, a motion, the impression of someone bent, working, endlessly working, though when they look directly, there is nothing, only water, only light, only the eternal whisper of the stream. They do not speak of it. They walk on. They tell themselves it was mist, or shadow, or the trick of tired eyes. But they remember. And in remembering, they become part of the story, another link in the chain of witnesses that stretches back 1,000 years. The washer does not need belief to exist. She never did. She is not sustained by faith, but by function, by the eternal fact of death, by the human need to make meaning from loss. As long as people die, and people will always die, there will be some part of the collective unconscious that manifests as her, as the woman who washes, who mourns, who prepares. She may not appear at streams anymore. She may appear in dreams, in visions during hospice vigils, in the half-sleeping thoughts of nurses during the graveyard shift. She may be the inexplicable feeling that makes you call your mother, only to learn she has hours left. She may be the dream that wakes you with certainty that it is time to go home, to make peace, to say goodbye. She adapts. She endures. She continues her work in whatever form the age allows. The contemporary priest and scholar John O'Donoghue, who walked the Irish coastline and wrote of Celtic spirituality, said this: "In the Celtic imagination, there is no ultimate separation between the visible and invisible worlds. They are not two different worlds, but one world in different dimensions. The washer at the ford is not a superstition. She is a recognition that there are presences around us, witnesses to our lives, attendants at our crossings. Perhaps this is the way to understand her, not as literal entity or pure metaphor, but as presence, something that exists in the borderland between material and meaning, between fact and interpretation, between the world as mechanism and the world as mystery. She is what appears when we allow ourselves to see, and we need desperately to learn to see again. We need the capacity to acknowledge death before it arrives, to honor the dying, to create rituals of preparation and passage. We need to know that grief can begin early, that mourning is not weakness, that the work of letting go takes time and attention. We need the permission to be afraid, to be sad, to sense what is coming even when we cannot prove it. We need the washer at the ford, not as literal woman, but as what she represents, the attentive witness, the grief bearer, the one who says that death matters, that it will be honored, that the crossing will not go unnoticed. In Iceland, there is a practice called utiseta, sitting out. You go to a sacred place at night and sit in silence until dawn, opening yourself to whatever presences inhabit that place, whatever messages the land has to offer. You do not demand, you do not control, you simply make yourself available, receptive, patient. Perhaps this is what is needed, a sitting out beside streams, a patient attention to the sound of water, a willingness to perceive what the rational mind dismisses, not credulity, not superstition, but openness, the openness to the possibility that there are things we do not understand, forces we cannot measure, presences that attend our lives, whether we acknowledge them or not. The washer does not need you to believe in her, but you might need to believe in what she represents, that death is not the enemy, that prophecy can be mercy, that grief is sacred work, that endings can be faced with tenderness, that water remembers, that the landscape is alive, that we are not alone in our crossings. The old Scottish prayer, collected by Carmichael from the women of the Hebrides, goes like this: Be the great God between thy two shoulders, to protect thee in thy going and in thy coming. And may the washer at the ford see thee first, that thou mayest ask the question and have time to prepare. This is not a prayer of fear, but of hope, that death will announce itself, that we will have warning, that we will have time to repair what needs repairing, time to speak what needs speaking, time to ready ourselves for the crossing. The washer grants this time, she always has. And so we return to the stream, to the mist, rising white in the hour before dawn, to the sound of water over stone, endless and unchanging, to the sense, impossible to prove, impossible to dismiss, that someone is there, working, witnessing, preparing. You cannot see her clearly. You were never meant to. She exists at the edge of vision, at the threshold of perception, in that space where certainty dissolves and mystery begins. She is the figure you almost see when you wake suddenly in the night. She is the presence you sense when you sit by the bedside of the dying. She is the dream that returns and returns, the woman by the water, washing, always washing. She is still there. The question is not whether she exists. The question is, can you hear the water? Can you stand close enough to the threshold to perceive what dwells there? Can you allow yourself to know what you already know? That death is coming for you, for everyone you love, and that this knowing is not despair, but clarity, not curse, but gift. Can you let her wash your shroud while you are still alive, so that when the time comes you are ready? So that the crossing is clean? So that nothing is left unsaid, undone, unfinished? This is her offering. This is what she has always offered, since the days when the Morrígan strode battlefields and women worshipped its springs, and the rivers carried the names of goddesses who are not quite forgotten. The stream beneath time is still flowing. The washer is still there. And the question that remains, echoing like water over stone, rippling like moonlight on the surface of the ford, is this: does she still wash? Or have we only forgotten how to listen?